The drifter rebuilt the ferry engine alone. Then the owner demanded it back. Sawyer Combs had $14, a duffel bag with a set of marine diesel tools he'd bought second-hand from a retiring tugboat mechanic, and a habit of walking riverbanks rather than highways whenever a river happened to run alongside his route, a habit that had led him, twice already that year, to exactly the kind of forgotten machinery that kept him fed for a few weeks at a stretch. He was 22 years old, laid off from a towboat company's maintenance crew 9 months earlier, when the company consolidated its fleet and cut half its shoreside mechanics, and he had been moving through river towns ever since, taking whatever short-term work he could find. The consolidation had come with a severance letter that praised his work ethic in the same paragraph that explained why his position no longer existed, language Sawyer had read often enough since to understand it as the specific corporate dialect for, "We've decided you cost more than we're willing to keep paying." He had spent 9 months since then relearning, river town by river town, that a marine mechanic's specialized skills mattered a great deal less to most employers than whether he had a fixed address and a reference from the last 6 months, two things that grew harder to produce the longer a man stayed on the move. He found the ferry at Shoal Bend on a cool spring afternoon, tied up at a listing dock on the near bank of a river too wide and too swift to ford easily. A flat-decked vessel, perhaps 60 feet long, with a small pilot house and an engine compartment sealed behind rusted steel doors. A faded sign on the dock read, "Shoal Bend Ferry, Prater's Landing Crossing, out of service," and beneath it, hand-lettered and considerably newer, "Property of M. Corbett. Do not board." Sawyer stood at the dock a long while before he stepped aboard anyway. He had grown up the son of a towboat engineer, spending summers below decks learning the particular logic of marine diesel engines. The difference between a cylinder merely ceased from disuse and one actually scored beyond repair, a distinction that had never once failed him even after the consolidation took away the only steady work he'd ever wanted to do. He worked the engine compartment's door loose and found inside a marine diesel engine coated in the specific greasy dust of a machine that had simply stopped running rather than actually failed catastrophically, connected to a paddle-wheel drive mechanism along the vessel's stern. He walked the flat deck slowly before he touched anything further, the way his father had always insisted a man learn a vessel before presuming to fix it. The hull itself, a riveted steel pontoon design, showed surface rust but no through holes when he checked it with a screwdriver at a dozen points along the waterline. The pilot house's controls sat exactly where a captain would have left them decades ago. Throttle and clutch levers frozen with disuse rather than damage, a brass ship's bell still hanging above the door, green with age but intact. He did not have a plan yet beyond understanding what he was looking at. In 9 months on the road, he had learned that was usually plan enough to start with. He walked into Shoal Bend itself the next morning looking for day work, and found, within his first hour in town, that the ferry carried more weight in local frustration than its condemned sign suggested. "That ferry ran for 60 years before it stopped," said an older woman behind the counter of the town's post office and general store, her name tag reading Agnes. County built the highway bridge 15 miles downstream back in the 70s, and Miles Corbett, who owns the ferry franchise, decided it wasn't worth running anymore once the bridge opened. Problem is, 15 miles downstream and back adds the better part of an hour to anybody's trip across this river. And the school bus route, the mail truck, half the farm traffic on this side of the water still feels that hour every single day. So the ferry just sat, and Corbett never fixed it, Sawyer said. "Corbett doesn't live within 40 miles of here anymore," Agnes said. "Inherited the franchise from his father, and once the bridge made the crossing less profitable, he simply stopped sending anybody to maintain it. Counties asked him twice to either run it or release the franchise back to public control. He's done neither, because as long as he holds the franchise, nobody else can legally operate a competing crossing here, whether he actually uses it or not." She studied Sawyer a moment. Why the interest? No reason, Sawyer said, which was, as it seemed to be for anyone answering that particular question in any town exactly like this one, a lie. Agnes Taylor, as Sawyer learned over his first several days in Shoal Bend, had run the post office for over 30 years and remembered the Ferry's working era better than most in town, including the particular rhythm of Captain Ezra Doss, who had piloted the vessel for nearly 3 decades before his retirement, not long before the highway bridge opened. She started walking down to the dock most evenings after she closed the post office, at first simply to satisfy her own curiosity about whether the old engine could genuinely run again, and later, as the weeks passed, bringing him a hot meal more evenings than not. The particular generosity of someone who had decided, somewhere in that first week, that a young man doing honest work for a town that mostly doubted him deserved better than cold rations from a duffel bag. Wasn't going to eat all of it myself anyway, she'd say, setting down a covered plate, in a tone Sawyer was slowly learning meant considerably more than the words themselves let on. Captain Doss kept that engine running through weather that would have stopped a lesser boat, Agnes said on Sawyer's third visit to the store. Man knew every knock and rattle that engine ever made, same as he knew the river itself. I always thought it was a particular kind of shame that the crossing died the same decade he retired, as though the whole system simply lost the person who understood it best, right when it needed him. The mockery, when it came mostly from a couple of men who worked the feed mill and drank their coffee at the diner counter each morning, one of whom made a point of asking, loud enough for Sawyer to hear across the room, whether the drifter fixing up Corbett's old scow understood he was wasting his time on a boat that legally belonged to somebody who'd never once asked for his help. Sawyer said nothing to that, because he had learned, over 9 months of exactly this kind of comment in exactly this kind of town, that defending yourself to men who had already decided what you were rarely changed anything except your own dignity. A woman at the diner counter was kinder in manner, but no more encouraging in substance, telling him over his first cup of coffee that a young man ought to think twice before pouring his labor into a boat somebody else legally owned, whatever the county's frustrations with the crossing might be. Sawyer didn't argue that point either. He had learned, in 9 months of exactly this kind of well-meant caution, that most people offering it weren't actually curious about his reasons. They simply wanted permission to stop wondering about the stranger drinking coffee at their counter, and a quiet nod usually granted that faster than any real explanation could. Sawyer spent his first full week aboard the ferry doing the only thing he knew how to do with what little he had. He looked at what was actually broken and started fixing it. The main engine cylinders, when he pulled the head to inspect them, showed surface rust, but no scoring. Exactly the kind of condition an engine developed from simple disuse, rather than any real mechanical failure. He worked the pistons free over 4 careful days, honing the cylinder walls lightly, and replacing the piston rings with a rebuild kit he bought with his first week's odd job wages in town. The same patient process his father had taught him for any marine engine that had sat idle too long. The fuel system needed a full cleaning, decades-old diesel having gummed the injectors and fuel lines into uselessness, and Sawyer spent nearly a week disassembling and cleaning each component by hand, testing the injector spray pattern against an improvised rig he built from scrap fittings before trusting any of them back into the engine. He drained the old fuel tank entirely, found it mercifully free of the rust-through that would have doomed the whole restoration before it started, and refilled it gradually with fresh diesel purchased a few gallons at a time as his odd job wages allowed, running the engine only briefly at first to guard against any lingering contamination working its way into the newly cleaned injectors. The paddle wheel drive mechanism itself, a chain and sprocket system connecting the engine to the wheel's axle, had rusted at several links, and Sawyer replaced the worst sections with salvaged chain he found, remarkably intact, in a dockside supply shed, working the whole drivetrain by hand afterward to make certain nothing bound before he ever trusted it to run under power. The loading ramp itself, the hinged steel platform that let vehicles drive on and off the ferry at either bank, had seized on its pivot points from decades of rust, and Sawyer spent 3 days freeing the hinges and rebuilding the hand-cranked winch that raised and lowered it, testing the mechanism repeatedly under increasing weight with sandbags before he trusted it with an actual vehicle. The hull's ballast tanks, meant to keep the vessel trimmed level as vehicles loaded unevenly across the deck, needed their valves freed and tested individually, work that took most of another week down in a cramped, low compartment beneath the deck plating. By the time Sawyer finally ran the engine through its first full test, with the ferry actually underway rather than simply idling at the dock, a small crowd had gathered along both banks to watch, word having spread through Shoal Bend the way it always did. Once people noticed the old vessel's running lights lit after dark for the first time in over a decade, the paddle wheel churned the river to foam as the ferry made its slow crossing and back, and the small crowd on the near bank let out something between a cheer and a collective exhale that Sawyer felt more than heard over the engine's steady rhythm. An older man in the crowd, leaning on a cane, was heard telling his grandson that the boat sounded exactly the way he remembered it sounding when Captain Doss still ran her, which struck Sawyer, overhearing it, as about the finest review his repair work could have hoped for. It was in that same dockside supply shed, tucked into a metal box behind a stack of old maintenance forms, that Sawyer found the logbook, its cover reading Ezra Doss, Master, Shoal Bend Ferry, 1938-1971. He read it that same evening by lantern light, and understood, well before he'd finished the first section, exactly why Agnes Teller had spoken of Captain Doss with the particular reverence she had. Doss had piloted the ferry for 33 years, and his logbook recorded not just engine maintenance, but the specific terms of the franchise itself, terms Doss had apparently taken care to preserve in his own hand, alongside the official county record. The franchise granted to this crossing in 1938 requires continuous operation, defined as service no less than 4 days per week, to remain valid. Doss had written, should operation lapse for a continuous period exceeding 3 years, the franchise reverts automatically to county control, to be reissued by public auction or operated directly by the county itself. I record this here because franchise holders have, in other counties, quietly let a crossing lapse, and then reasserted rights they no longer legally held, counting on nobody troubling to check the actual terms. There was a later entry, dated near Doss's retirement, that Sawyer read a second time before setting the logbook aside for the night. I have told the county clerk directly that whoever succeeds Corbett's father in this franchise ought to be reminded of the continuous operation clause, because I don't trust a man who's never once piloted this boat himself to understand what he actually holds versus what he merely believes he owns. A franchise is not a possession. It is a public trust, conditioned on service, and it was never meant to be a thing a man could simply sit on indefinitely while calling it his. Sawyer closed the logbook and sat with it a long while, doing the arithmetic without needing to write it down. The ferry had been out of service for well over a decade, meaning that whatever legal claim Miles Corbett believed he still held over the crossing had very likely lapsed back to county control years before Sawyer had ever set foot on the dock. He thought about his own father's consolidated fleet, about how easily a company had decided a route wasn't worth running anymore the moment it stopped serving the bottom line, and understood that Captain Doss had anticipated, decades in advance, the exact kind of quiet abandonment that had since cost Sawyer his own livelihood on a different river entirely. It felt less like a coincidence than like a lesson finally catching up with the person who needed it most. Miles Corbett arrived at Shoal Bend on a gray Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after Sawyer had begun his work, having heard, the way absent owners eventually heard everything about property they'd stopped paying attention to, that a stranger was restoring the ferry he still considered his. "Name's Miles Corbett," the man said, stepping off the dock ramp with the particular irritation of someone whose property had done something inconvenient without his permission. I hold the franchise on this crossing, inherited from my father. Whatever work you've done here, I'll be resuming operation myself, or selling the vessel and the franchise rights to whoever's interested, now that it's apparently worth something again. Your father's franchise required continuous operation to stay valid, Sawyer said. Captain Doss's own logbook records the exact terms, 4 days a week minimum, reverting to county control after 3 years of lapse. This ferry's been idle for well over a decade. I don't think the franchise you're describing still legally belongs to you. Corbett's expression carried the particular confidence of a man unused to being challenged on matters he'd never bothered to research himself. That's an old boat captain's personal notes, he said, not a legal document. I own this vessel and this crossing, and I'd suggest you clear off it before I involve the sheriff in the matter. I'd suggest you check with the county recorder before you do, Sawyer said. If the franchise reverted years ago the way Captain Doss's terms describe, involving the sheriff might raise exactly the question you'd rather not have asked. My father held this franchise for 30 years, Corbett said. I don't intend to lose it to a drifter's reading of an old man's diary. Your father let this crossing sit idle for over a decade the moment it stopped making him money, Sawyer said. I'd think a franchise that requires continuous public service ought to matter more to whoever holds it than whatever profit he can extract from simply sitting on the paper. That's not my reading of Captain Doss's diary. That's the actual language of the 1938 grant, which I understand is a public record any county clerk can produce. Corbett's composure faltered, just slightly, before he turned and walked back up the dock ramp without another word, driving off in a truck considerably newer than anything else in Shoal Bend. Word reached Agnes Teller by that same evening, and she came down to the dock herself, standing at the ferry's rail with an expression Sawyer hadn't seen on her before. Corbett's father let that franchise lapse the same year he stopped running the crossing, Agnes said. I remember it clearly enough, because half this town complained to the county about it at the time and got nowhere. If Captain Doss's terms are accurate, and I've no reason to think they aren't, the county's had the legal right to reclaim this crossing for years and simply never exercised it, likely because nobody ever pressed the question directly. Then I intend to press it, Sawyer said. Then I'll help you do it properly, Agnes said. I've got 30 years of postal records showing exactly how long this crossing's been out of service, if the county needs proof beyond an old captain's logbook. The county meeting Agnes arranged fell 12 days later, called informally through the recorder's office once she'd insisted on comparing the franchise's continuous operation clause against the ferry's actual service history, and it drew a substantial portion of Shoal Bend's residents, many of them people whose daily commute had been quietly costing them an extra hour for a decade and a half. Miles Corbett arrived with a folder of his own, insisting the franchise remained his regardless of any lapse in service, since no formal reversion had ever been processed by the county. It was the recorder who addressed that argument directly. The franchise terms are self-executing, she said, reading from the original 1938 grant. Reversion occurs automatically upon a lapse exceeding 3 years. It doesn't require the county to process anything for the reversion itself to have already taken legal effect. What the county failed to do was formally reissue the franchise afterward, which is an oversight on our part, not evidence that Mr. Corbett's rights survived the lapse. The school district's transportation coordinator spoke next, a folder of her own bus route logs in hand. I've routed our east side buses around by the highway bridge for 11 years, she said. That's an extra 40 minutes each way on top of an already long route for our youngest students. I'd like this board to weigh that against Mr. Corbett's argument before deciding anything further. A farmer near the back of the room, one of several who'd shown up specifically to speak, stood without waiting to be called on. I've driven the long way around this river for 15 years because Mr. Corbett decided it wasn't profitable to keep running a crossing. Half this county depends on, he said. I'd like this board to reissue that franchise to whoever's actually willing to run it, rather than let it sit idle another 15 years because the paperwork never quite caught up to what everybody in this room already knew. The board voted that same evening to formally recognize the franchise's reversion to county control and opened a public process to reissue it. A process Agnes made certain named Sawyer's restoration work explicitly as the reason the crossing was even a viable option again. The highway bridge closed unexpectedly 6 weeks later, a structural inspection finding cracks serious enough to warrant emergency repairs, cutting off the county's only other river crossing at the exact moment Shoal Bend's school buses, mail routes, and farm traffic needed an alternative most urgently. It was Agnes who reached Sawyer first, breathless from hurrying down from the post office. Bridge could be closed 2 weeks, maybe longer, she said. County's asking whether the ferry can run a real schedule starting tomorrow morning, not just the test runs you've been doing. The engine's held steady on every test I've run for a month now, Sawyer said, already moving to check every connection one final time under the pressure of the moment. I can run a real schedule. I'll need help managing the loading ramp and the crossing traffic, but the engine itself is ready. Sawyer ran the ferry on a full daily schedule for the first time in over a decade. Farm trucks and the county school bus and the mail carrier's van all crossing on a rotation, Sawyer managed from the pilot house with a checklist he'd copied directly from Captain Doss's own logbook, noting departure times, engine temperature, and river conditions after every single crossing the way Doss himself had once done without fail. Agnes coordinated the loading queue on the near bank, keeping the schedule running smoothly enough that the school bus never once missed its morning window. On the third day of the emergency schedule, the paddle wheel drive chain, under sustained load it hadn't carried in years, began slipping at a splice Sawyer had made weeks earlier, the wheel's rhythm stuttering just enough that Sawyer felt it through the deck plating before any gauge confirmed it. With a line of vehicles already waiting on both banks and the school bus due within the hour, he shut the engine down, climbed into the cramped drive housing, and retensioned the chain by hand, working quickly but carefully, aware the whole time that a rushed repair now could cost the whole crossing considerably more time than the hour he was spending to do it right. The drive caught properly again within that hour, and the schedule resumed without the bus ever needing to wait past its usual crossing time. Miles Corbett arrived at the dock himself during the second week of the emergency crossing, having heard, the way everyone eventually heard everything in a county this size, that the ferry he'd tried to reclaim was now running a full public schedule under a franchise that no longer belonged to him at all. "That's my father's engine carrying that schedule," Corbett said, watching a farm truck roll off the ramp onto the far bank. "It's the county's franchise now and my engine work keeping it running," Sawyer said. "Your father let this crossing die because it stopped making him money the moment the bridge opened. It's carrying this county through an emergency right now precisely because somebody finally understood a public crossing isn't supposed to exist only when it's profitable for whoever holds the paper on it." Corbett didn't have an answer for that. He watched the ferry complete another crossing, the school bus rolling carefully up the ramp on the near side, and left without further argument. And Agnes told Sawyer afterward that she doubted Shoal Bend would be hearing from him again. By the time the highway bridge reopened 3 weeks later, the county had formally reissued the ferry franchise under a public operating agreement, with Sawyer named as the crossing's permanent licensed operator, a role that came with a modest county salary, and more importantly to Sawyer, a legal claim to the work he'd already spent 2 months proving he could do properly. Miles Corbett did not contest the county's decision further, and Agnes mentioned some weeks later that he'd quietly sold whatever remaining equipment and dockside land he still held title to on the far bank, Apparently having concluded that a franchise he could no longer control wasn't worth the trouble of holding on to out of spite alone. Sawyer wrote to his father that autumn, describing the ferry's engine in more mechanical detail than the man probably needed, but would certainly enjoy anyway. A marine diesel finally given somewhere real to run after 9 months of Sawyer, wondering whether that particular skill still had a place in the world at all. His father's reply came a few weeks later, characteristically brief and warm. Knew a well-built marine engine could outlast any company's decision that it wasn't worth the trouble anymore. Proud of you for finding it a river to actually work on. Your grandfather ran boats on this same kind of river his whole life. Sounds like you found your way back to exactly where our family always belonged. Sawyer kept Ezra Doss's logbook in the same dockside shed where he'd found it, and added a second logbook of his own beside it. On its first page, he wrote the only sentence that felt honest enough to begin with. This crossing was nearly left to rot forever because the man who held the paper on it decided it wasn't worth his trouble unless it made him money. Captain Doss knew better than that. A public crossing belongs to the public it serves, not to whoever happens to hold the franchise while doing nothing with it. I intend to keep it that way for as long as this county needs the crossing. Agnes Teller stopped by the dock most weeks after that, not always with news, sometimes only to watch the ferry complete another crossing from the post office's front step. The particular satisfaction of a woman who had spent 15 years watching her town absorb an extra hour of travel every day and had finally been allowed to stop, merely tolerating it. The school district's transportation coordinator rerouted the East Side bus permanently that following semester, shaving 40 minutes off the youngest student's morning commute, and made a point of stopping by the dock personally to thank Sawyer once the new schedule had run smoothly for a full month without incident. The two feed mill workers who'd once mocked Sawyer at the diner counter became, somewhat to his private amusement, two of the ferry's most regular passengers, once the crossing reopened permanently, hauling grain across on a route considerably shorter than the highway detour they'd been driving for years. Neither of them ever mentioned their earlier comments directly, but one of them took to nodding at Sawyer each morning with something that had, over the following months, become close enough to genuine respect that Sawyer no longer thought much about the earlier mockery at all. Sawyer thought, some evenings, about his own father's towboat career, ended by a consolidation that had valued efficiency over the actual people the fleet had once served, and understood that Captain Doss's insistence on a public crossing's true purpose was the same argument his father had made, less formally, every time a company decided a route wasn't profitable enough to keep running, regardless of who actually depended on it. He had found, in a forgotten ferry engine at the edge of a river town, exactly the kind of work his own family had always believed mattered, running finally on terms that couldn't be quietly abandoned the moment it stopped being convenient for somebody else's bottom line. He rang the brass ship's bell above the pilot house door at the start of every morning crossing after that, a habit he'd picked up from Captain Doss's own logbook entries describing the same routine decades earlier, and found that the sound carried clean and bright across the water each time. The one small ceremony that told both banks, without a word needing to be said, that the crossing was open, running, and once again exactly what it had always been meant to be. So here's the question worth sitting with tonight. How many public things get quietly held hostage by an owner who no longer actually serves them, simply because nobody thought to check whether his claim on them ever really survived his neglect? And what does it take? A bridge closure, a stranger, a captain's careful logbook, for a crossing to finally belong again to the people who actually cross it. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Salvage Line for more, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight.